Josh, do you want to drive since you did
I
the?
would be happy to. I had started going through some of the nominated items.
Oh, actually,
Um,
I'll share my window just to keep
Go for
us
it.
semi-synchronized.
So before everybody got here, I had already looked and saw the three um, nominated issues or sorry, PHI issues, and those three issues were the same ones we talked about last week that we don't think we're making forward progress on that's worth talking about in the meeting. So I think the next one would be the well-formedness check on types with no type parameters. That one was nominated, and you wanted to see that one. Folks wanted to see that one discussed in a meeting.
Sorry,
69741.
wait, before we go to this, I had a question. I got a little distracted here. Maybe I'm just confused. I wanted to talk about the design meeting scheduling. Did we discuss that?
Okay.
Just to, are we still at the same Monday time at this moment? We haven't made any changes, right?
So we haven't made any changes yet. It was a little late last week, and then this week there was some juggling going on. It would probably be a good idea to go ahead and make the change now on Thursday so that people have Friday, Monday, and so on to get used to the change and see when the new meeting is going to be. So it would be a good idea to go ahead and nail down when those times are.
Okay. Do you have a time in mind for the design meeting, or do you want to do that offline, I guess?
There are a couple, yes. So the best time for the most attendees, which would be the time we should use for the design meeting, is going to be Wednesdays at 10 to 11 a.m. U.S. Pacific time.
Okay.
So that's a time that everyone who filled out the doodle, which includes all of the members of the Lang team and several of our regular attendees, all marked as okay. Scott had that one as an it is need be, but I talked to Scott separately, and it sounded like that time would work.
Okay. So we can just
So I think that's going to be our best time for the design meeting. And then for the triage meeting, I'm looking for a time that at a minimum all 6 members of the Lang team can attend. And there are a handful of times that work for that, but none ideally, and all of them are going to have some people marked as if need be. So we need to figure out who minds doing which times.
Okay. Maybe we should do not during this live meeting right now, I guess, then.
Yeah, I agree. But we should start a Zulip discussion to confirm which time we should use. But I think we should go ahead and commit to moving the design meeting to Wednesday, 10 a.m. U.S. Pacific. And I will take the responsibility of writing that up for a blog post and changing the calendar entry, but I'm hoping to write up one post that also says, and we've moved the triage meeting. So I'd like to figure that out today as well.
Okay, that's fine. I just adjusted the calendar though.
Oh, okay.
Just drag and drop. All right, let's move on then. The next meeting will be to talk about the process proposal, right? That's still the plan. Guess we lost Josh. But I think that's still the plan.
My tab just crashed. Can you hear me again?
Yes.
Okay. I was going to say, so that means that the May 11th meeting will be moved, and yes, you already got that. Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Are there any other items we should go through before we start going through the more mechanical parts of triage?
Nope.
Okay. All right, then let's take a look at nominated PRs. I unnominated 68717 because it's just waiting on people to check their boxes. It is already in FCP, or rather in proposed FCP. So if anybody doesn't want to check a box there and wants to register an objection, then they can do that asynchronously. Nico, do you believe there's progress we can make on 69741 in this meeting while forming this check on types with no parameters?
I mean, yes and no. So there's like a bigger discussion to be had about what we want to do, but we could potentially make a narrow decision about whether we want to make a sort of incremental, inconsistent sort of change. Like what this PR did was basically to introduce additional checking, but that checking only takes place if the type alias has no generic parameters, and otherwise it doesn't, which I think is not a great place to stay for a long time. It might be an okay place to land as a transition point. You know, so an example, I don't know, an example would be that this would error with the PR, but this would not.
I see. So the goal would be catching this before you instantiate it?
Yeah, today it would error once you use it, but under this PR, the type declaration itself would be invalid, which is a breaking change, right? So there may, I forget, we probably did a create a run, but there may be creates effectively.
Okay. So the long-term goal would be to try to catch the second one at declaration time as well?
Well, that's what we have to discuss. But
okay.
I think there's general consensus that that's probably what one might expect. Based on the
rest. Is this a design meeting worth of discussion, or is this something we should try to decide in this meeting?
I think the only thing we could decide in this meeting is, do we just want to leave this blocked until we discuss it more broadly? I guess there are three things we might decide. Do we want to leave this blocked until we discuss it more broadly? Do we want to close it and still try to discuss it more broadly? Just saying basically, we don't want to do this in isolation, but we might do it as part of the plan. And let's get it off the PR queue for now. Well, that's, I guess, a minor thing. And the final thing would be just to say, you know, we just don't think we're going to tackle this problem right now because it's so long-standing. My personal inclination would be, I don't know, I don't care. I guess I think we should talk about it as part of our addition ramp up. I'm semi-inclined to close the PR only because I forget if this is assigned to me, but I have too many open PRs and they stress me out. But it's kind of an orthogonal problem to whether we should talk about this issue more broadly. And I think we should. I guess I would say, I wouldn't like to land in a place where we're giving warnings. Like, I think that'd be even more confusing than the current state. So I wouldn't want to do this by itself. That's my opinion. We lost Josh again.
I'm back.
Okay.
I'm going to try without video and see if that's better.
Sounds good. So maybe the takeaway is we should just schedule a meeting.
Sounds reasonable. Should we put it on the design meeting agenda then?
Yeah, I think it already is, but if not, we'll put it back.
Okay.
We'll move on.
Okay, let's in-queue that for that then. So the next one up is Let's go back to 71,599, coercion between functions and non-capturing closures. Nico, you nominated this one as well for discussion because of the change to the type behavior.
You did, although I don't see it in this list. Is it in a different section?
I just used the link at the top and I'm reading through.
Oh, okay. We didn't update this. Okay.
So yes,
right.
It should probably be either copied into the document or we should process it here.
I'll put it in now, but yeah. So I can give a little background here. Stupid paper. No, thank you. I guess that goes here in the list. So what this is about, as some of you may recall, we added a extension at some point that let you write closure notation, but get out a function pointer, which has no captured environment. You can do that so long as the closure doesn't capture anything in the environment, and that's pretty useful. However, you have to do it right now, I think, in a fairly limited way. It has to be triggered by the expected type. So the code I wrote above works fine, but something like this does not, as far as I know. Someone could test it if they want, but I think that's true. And also what does not work, and what the PR is actually immediately trying to address, is something like something where you had like a list of function pointers and you try to combine foo, bar, and my own little closure. This will not type check today because it won't. but I think it would if you put in like an as here, so that the definition knows kind of when it's being type checked that it needs to be coerced. And so this PR makes some changes that try to make this last case type check. I think it's not too hard, and what I'm pushing towards is that we try to, if we're going to fix this, we try to fix it sort of across the board, so that in general a closure can be coerced, but if you do so, you get an error if it has captures. And I just wanted to like check in, inform people that this was happening. And hear if there are any concerns or thoughts. I'm going to guess no, based on the...
Given that we already support doing this via assignment, it sounds like this is just a natural extension to being able to use as for this. What would be the fundamental reason we wouldn't want to do this?
I can't think of any reason we wouldn't want to do it.
Can anyone else?
Yeah. I think it's also strictly backwards compatible in the sense that any case that it would now accept would have resulted in a type error in the past. The only reason I can think of that we might not want to do it is if there were some cases that would coerce differently, but I don't think that's true.
I'm assuming this is entirely separate from any future support where we might be able to support using capturing closures as functions.
I don't know how we could ever do that, but because function pointers don't carry any additional state beyond a pointer to code, I'm not sure how you could ever capture state. But if we did have a way to do it, I don't see how it would, again, just sort of make this work more often than it does, I guess.
then I don't see any reason why we wouldn't want to do this.
Yeah. Okay, very good.
So Asa asked in chat whether they should be taking minutes at the bottom or taking minutes in line. That's a good question.
I didn't realize somebody was taking minutes. That's awesome. I don't know.
For now, for simplicity's sake, maybe go ahead and take it down at the bottom like you're currently doing. And we haven't tried having point-by-point minutes the way that you're doing before. So why don't we assume for now that it should be separate, and if we decide later to integrate it the way we had been doing, we could do that?
I think whatever makes it easiest to make the minutes post is good by me.
Yeah, I'm all for that.
Yes. Agreed.
For the coercion thing, I think it could also be explained similar to the const block idea that Scott had, as sort of, we're simplifying what you have to type, even though technically it was legal before. We're just making it easier for you.
I'm not sure what was legal before. Oh,
well,
like
before
you arranged your code in just the right way, you mean?
Well,
you had the right type descriptions before. Like, is part of the issue that the
if you had the let X and then you manually put the type that it's supposed to be a fun, then it would coerce. But if you left off the coercion, then it wouldn't work. And now we're just saying, no, it works either way.
Like most notably, the last case you wrote, Nico, the let C equal slice or array, however you want to put it. If you put the type annotation on the C there, so you said let C colon array of function pointers, that would then work, right? Because that's analogous to the very first case you wrote.
That's right.
Okay, so yeah, that's sort of matches my understanding then. If this is just a matter of letting people not to write type descriptions down, seems okay.
I think it's slightly more general in the sense that this variable C, you now have access to the closure both with its closure type and with a function pointer type. Sorry, I don't know how to turn those off at the moment. But before you only had one or the other, but I think it's not a big difference.
I see, because now we have the dynamic behavior that as will extract the code pointer from the closure.
Yeah, but I guess you could oh no, that would be capturing. I don't know. Anyway, it's even more. It's slightly better than that. You can do some things you couldn't have done, but for the most part, you don't have to put weird annotations. The compiler will figure it out for you.
Kind of nice that you could still use it as a function object as well as turning it into a function pointer if you need that too.
Yeah, I think that's good. It reminds me of how this is off topic, but I'm going to go anyway. It just reminds me of the fact that because each function like foo and bar here has a unique type, it's been observed that today we require you to specify the ABI at the definition of the function, but if you want to have an alternative ABI, that is. But plausibly, we could allow it to get coerced to many different ABIs and just generate shins and things like that.
That would be nice to have.
Although it interacts with the FFI unwind decision, I realize now. That would work best if we had taken the other route, I think, where things interoperate smoothly with panics.
Well, that would let us turn funds into unsafe funds and stuff like that too, right? Or do we already do that?
Yeah, you could do that too.
And presumably you could, in an unsafe block, turn an unsafe fun into a fun.
Maybe. Yeah, it depends how far you want to go. You probably want to, I would guess you'd want to make that an explicit coercion.
Probably.
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like we might want to FCP merge this and confirm consensus.
Yeah, I can FCP merge.
Yeah, go ahead. And can you unnominate as well?
Yep.
Okay. Then shall we move on to the next item?
Yeah.
We have 71607, clarify the interaction of pin drop guarantee and panics. Something panicking so loud you can't hear a pin drop.
Did we get any clarification?
It looks like Ralph was looking for some guidance. I think we are on deck to provide guidance here, not to receive it.
I think so. Last time it said maybe that, I don't remember who said they would do it, maybe me, but that we should ping Taylor and or prep for next time. Seems like that's still true. So maybe we should do that.
You probably do that on the issue at a starting point then.
That's what I meant, or that's what I assume was intended here.
Taylor and who?
No, just Taylor would be the main one. I'll just write a comment in here, AC. Not a long one, saying, hey, Taylor. At the moment, unless anyone else feels they have an informed opinion. You're already good, very good.
Yeah, I think that the only question is, does pin make this different than in the non-pinned case in terms of, is it okay to free memory without calling the destructor of that memory? That is a really interesting question. And I can think of cases where if you don't call the destructor, bad things will happen, not least of which you will have code that might continue to access that memory unexpectedly and scribble over bits of the stack. If you're unwinding to the point where you will never return again, then it's probably less of an issue. If you are unwinding and you might catch panic and then call other functions and descend back into that part of the stack and reuse that pinned memory, then that seems very bad. Yeah, that's a good point, Locathor. The other alternative would be to abort if you get a failure in the middle of a drop.
And the exact question is, oh my God, my internet is so slow. The exact question that Ralph raised is it okay to deallocate the memory backing pinned data if you call the drop and the drop panicked?
Right.
In other words, I don't think we're directly answering anything here about non-pinned data.
True, but I'm saying that that is potentially a different question, though. If hypothetically you were talking about heap data, then if you just leave that data leaked, then yes, something might scribble over it in the background, but you're not ever going to reuse that memory, so it would probably be fine. On the stack, you don't have the option of leaking stack and skipping over it if you use that bit of the stack again. You're just going to, you either have to free it or you have to declare that stack dead, which means aborting.
Panicking in retrospect, I think we could have, I wish we had made it again. But we didn't.
We had made it what?
I wish we had said that panicking in destructors always aborts in retrospect. This has come up numerous times, and every time I feel like that would have been the better choice.
Or at the very least,
we could addition change that, right?
We could change that in an addition, although I don't know how.
It'd be hard to lint about ahead of time.
There's no way to detect if it. I mean, the only case where
standard library, you'd have to have different versions of the standard library for different editions then?
Oh, yeah.
It bubbles down into other things, right?
Yeah. It only affects the case where it only affects the case where you're dropping something not due to a panic. Double panics do abort, so this is
That's
one.
good.
Yeah.
Well, if you're in the middle of dropping something and you panic, we could technically call a function that the user can provide, and then we can say that if you do anything in that function other than return, like that function must return never, meaning not return. We could give you control over that if you need some way to potentially recover. But yeah, I don't see any way that you could reasonably recover from the situation Ralph is describing. Suppose that you are managing memory that is going to be DMA'd into or copied into, or some asynchronous operation is going to write into it. And you then try to, your drop would have canceled that operation. If that panics, the operation might not be canceled. So freeing the memory on the stack means you might scribble over part of the stack later when that operation completes.
It just seems like you're going to need drop guards, which is what Ralph says. So I guess it's either we somehow make some aborting on panic, or we require the user to abort on panic. I wonder if we could get away with changing this. Do people rely on it? Who knows? We never really know.
There's probably code out there that is relying on our behavior, but I think in this specific case, there is no useful alternative.
Well, the question is, does the drop have to, like, isn't the question, are we somehow going to automatically panic?
If we don't and we leave it to the user to panic somehow, then their panic might step on the part of the stack that we are confused about.
Sorry, I said panic, but I actually meant abort.
Oh, okay, abort.
The only question at hand is, who is going to abort in this case? Not if we should abort, but whose responsibility is it? And I don't quite know how we can do it unless we say that it's not obvious to me how we can make the drop, that would have deregistered your DMA request or whatever, how we can make that abort. Without making all drops abort, if there's a plan.
Well, one question is, could we just make all drops abort on panic?
Right. And I don't know the answer. I'm sure people do rely on it. I'm sure, I don't know how much I don't know if there's any like widely used pattern that relies on it.
I could certainly think of common cases where your drop might potentially panic, in terms of all you'd have to do is call .unwrap on some system function that you don't expect to error, and it errors.
Yeah, for sure. The question is, does anyone like take advantage of that in some way such that their code is
right? Does anybody catch unwind, for example?
I don't know. I think it seems like this is beyond the scope of this triage meeting to settle, but I think it seems like, yeah, I guess we can like weigh in on a thread. I mean, I kind of feel like the docs are probably good as far as they go, but we might want to consider a broader change.
Well,
okay.
The docs, as written, the docs suggest that you don't have to abort, right? The docs basically say that the user is the one responsible for putting in an abort if they need to cancel an operation.
Right. I mean, I don't yet understand. I'm going to ask Ralph on the thread, but I don't know how we could do anything other than that unless, like, if it's not the user, it has to be us. And if it's us, then I don't know what the criteria is that we're using to decide when we abort and when we don't. That's all.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, I will make a quick note on that issue, pointing out the one thing that we were talking about here of what use cases we're concerned about. And then if we want to have a longer discussion of should we migrate to abort in general, or can we abort just in this case, or is there something else we can do? We could either have that asynchronously or queue it up, or for that matter, see if we can get Taylor involved in that discussion. All right, so let's move on to the next item here. There we go. Add a must-use trait to complement must-use, the attribute. This was 5 days ago, and let's see who, Nico nominated this one.
Yes, I did. We've discussed it before. So I don't have I guess I'm not going to worry about the document. But let me pull up the PR. Since I'm sharing my screen, I might as well use it for something. The context is that, especially, we keep finding little cases where we'd like to extend must use to some wrapper types. But as we said before, when we consider this, we don't want to extend it uniformly because it doesn't allow one to sort of encapsulate a must use value. But in particular, with async await, it's kind of important because must use is how we prevent the case where you forget to await a future, which is a common mistake. And the example in this case is option. We want to propagate must use through option. So what this PR proposes, or is experimenting with, let's say, is, I guess it doesn't have an example, is adding a trait called must use, and then you can sort of say, I implement must use for all t, for option of t, if t is must use and stuff like that. I'm a little bit skeptical of this, but I don't want to color the discussion too much. Like we don't have Jonas in here. I don't know how strongly they would advocate for it. We've talked about it before, and I had basically the same concerns at that time. I just wanted to bring it up to sort of head off this direction if we don't want it, or encourage it if we think we do. I personally prefer to extend the attribute in a slightly more ad hoc way, but I can go into why. I'll leave it there for now.
I can definitely see how using the trait system here would give you a lot more power. You'd have the ability to say things like option of t is must use if t is must use. On the other hand, are there cases where that isn't universal? For instance, if result is must use, is there a case where option of result is something where we don't want to force you to use the result?
Okay, so you're saying, I'm not aware of any, I don't think I understand the question, maybe.
Are there any cases where writing this as a universal across types would interfere with people's ability to say, well, this function is different? The most obvious thing would be you've declared that in general, option of t must be used if t must be used, but you have an option of some value that's normally must use, and it turns out the semantics of your function are that it doesn't need to be used.
I don't think
that. Go ahead, Nico.
I was going to say that I don't think that occurs because, or at least like we don't handle that very well. But what does occur is you can apply the must use attribute to a function. It's sort of the other way. You can say the result of this function must be used, even though its type would not ordinarily have indicated that. You can say, and that does not, we can't express that in the trait system, which is one of my concerns with this design. But
that's exactly why I am asking about the reverse, which is there any case where you might want to be able to use an attribute on a function to say, no, you really don't have to use this despite its type being a must use? That doesn't seem like an issue when the only things marked as must use are like result, for example. But it does seem like an issue if the if we declare a huge swath of things must use dynamically based on trait, we may well run into cases where we want to say, no, that isn't really must use.
So I've been pondering that in from a like, so I'll jump back for a second, sorry. Conditional behavior into the attribute doesn't make me super excited. It feels like if we want to have conditional behavior for this is must use if something else is must use based on types, the trait version certainly seems the obvious syntax for doing that. But at the same time, I also don't think I really want to ever see someone bounded generic by the fact that the T must be must use somehow, because that feels really weird. So the thing I was pondering exploring is like, so we've said that, okay, maybe we want option of future to be must use. Would we want vec of future to be must use? And as we go that path, are we at the point where like, if we do extend this to be conditional, is this sort of in the domain of absolutely everything would end up being this conditional must use? Because, you know, if you put a future in a hash map, then that hash map should arguably be must use for the same reason that option should be must use, which makes me wonder if maybe we could do something like we always propagate it out, but there's some form of this attribute that where you can say, no, I promise I've encapsulated any must use if you do have this case where like your random custom struct or a thing that has a phantom data of T in it does not need to be must use just because it's holding a must use.
Effectively, under what circumstances does putting it into the structure count as using it?
Yeah, that it feels like the vast majority of the time putting it into the structure should just make that structure also be must use in some way.
Is it?
Sounds related to OIBITs in some way, right? Am I crazy for saying some sort of connection between this and
yeah? It's a structural behavior. It's a structural thing that happens automatically that you can opt out of. Yeah.
I think there's a big difference between this and OIBITs, which is that, or auto traits, is that for example, I would not think that this struct would be must use.
Looking for where you're currently typing.
Hopefully it's shared. Because I think that what is being proposed is sort of specific to generic types. Like if I wanted foo to be must use, I would make foo must use here where I've hard coded the result. But in contrast, if I had a bar and T turns out to be a result, that's the case I think that Scott is referring to.
Interesting.
That's not how auto traits behave. And so that seems different to me. This is exactly, I don't actually remember exactly what the proposal was that we kind of pushed back on, but I think it was more or less the expansive version that you were naming, Scott. It might have been different. And I remember at the time there were a number of examples of what seemed like pretty clear false positives, or at least potentially false positives. I think our conclusion at the time was not like hard no, but more like not obvious yes. Like this requires an RFC and just broader discussion before we would, because it's kind of not a backwards incompatible change, but it's definitely a massive.
It's a very noisy one.
Yeah, it's a noisy.
I think that it's still true that if we want somebody to do this, they're going to need to write it up and handle all the implications. But I would also add something that this seems really elegant in that like the trait system feels like a good fit for this. On the other hand, I'm wondering if it actually is a good fit or if it's just the closest fit that feels like what we have in our type system, because this is kind of an infectious property that shouldn't really affect the type itself. It's almost more an aspect of a particular instance of a type. You could have a vec of something that isn't must use and a vec of something that is must use, even if they're the same type and they just naturally convert from one another and coerce. that would actually allow you to handle the case where calling this function returns a U64 that is must use, even though U64 in general isn't must use. Then you could express the idea that, well, this function's output type is actually the must use version of this type, which is in every way identical to the non must use version, except that we'll give you a lint if you don't use it.
Whoa.
This sounds like it's getting into flow state or something, which scares me a little.
You're proposing
Like,
that if you
should it maybe just be a new type?
You're proposing that if you did this, Josh, using my example above, you get a warning because the vec of bool sort of, I mean, I don't think it would be, I don't know, it wouldn't exactly be flow state. It would be probably that I don't know what it would be, but it's a sort of a local expression property, but.
It's kind of a taint system that's semi-orthogonal to the type system. Effectively, if you have a U64, it's always a U64. It might be a U64 with the property must use. And if you put that in a U64, that becomes a U64 with the property must use.
No, we're not doing this. No offense. It's a good idea.
I'm not suggesting we should do it. The reason I brought that up was not to say, let's do this. The reason I brought this up was to say, I think this might be more complicated than just the trait system. And if somebody's going to make a full RFC proposal for it, they should actually look into that and decide, is this the right fit or not? And in particular, a good sign that it's the right fit would be if they can integrate must use for functions and must use for types into the same overall underlying model.
I think my concern is when you wind up with types that are the same, but they're not the same, it just, we're wrestling with that in a lot of, it's just a really big implementation complexity. So that's not, it's not to say that, and I appreciate you weren't necessarily advocating for that. I'm just saying I wouldn't go that direction, but there might be a way to nonetheless make this warn. It is more, it works differently. I don't know if it should or shouldn't warn. Or, you know, it's only works so far, like you don't have to necessarily combine in that way. But anyway, I sort of have mixed opinions. I still feel like the trait system appears to be a good fit, but it isn't. When you look more closely, you're like, do we want something that's like, it's must use if it's debug? I don't know. Maybe, I guess I don't know why to forbid it, but it just seems like it'll be confusing to people because it's such a sharp tool for such a blunt purpose.
The other thing this is reminding me of is the conversation of we don't want people to have to put must use on every single function because be able to guess for obvious cases, whatever that means. The tracking issue for must use is talking about, no, let's not go and put this on the 95% of methods in the standard library that take a ref and return something and they don't have any side effects, but we don't want to force people to write must use on all of those anyway. We should just figure out that, hey, it's fine, which this is sort of feeling to me like the type version of that conversation for functions of the, if anytime you hold a generic, it's relatively common that someone will say, but I wanted to know if I put a result in there that I should use it, then we should find a way to just do that and have an opt-out. And then maybe that would allow us to do the same thing for functions, that we could have that simple rule that, look, you're going to get a warning for not using the result of a function if it takes a ref to something that's freeze. And you know, if it doesn't take any mutable references and all of its shared references are to freeze things, then it, in some sense, must not have done anything. And if you're doing something super weird, you can opt out of it with, I don't know, strongman must use never or something. But then we could do the same thing on types where option, because it has the generic, as example here does, just becomes must use, and you can opt out of that if for some reason it's inappropriate for your type.
That's how Derive works.
We do have to, yes.
Meantime,
I just don't really want to force people to put derive derive must use on all their types either.
by the way, we spent a lot of time on this issue, and our meeting time is drawing to a close. I don't know if we want to move on, and so we're
I think it would.
Consensus here on what to do.
I think it would be worth moving on and seeing if we can get through some of the other items up for discussion.
Yeah, that's a good point, Felix. But I think I raised that in my comment.
So looking at the nominated issues, a quick glance through that one, we went through 3 of these in the last meeting, and I don't think something has changed since then other than, yes, we'd really like to do raw pointers to solve ReproPack. But their tracking issue for config version got nominated for discussion. And it sounds like we actually have an implementation of config version that's close to ready. But in any case, the discussion was effectively, should a nightly version of the compiler for the purposes of version count as that version of the compiler? So at what point should a compiler start passing a version 1.45 check? Stable 1.5, beta 1.5, or nightly leading up to 1.45? And the RFC did originally discuss this and had originally come to the conclusion of, as soon as you bump the version in the compiler, meaning nightly, you would start passing config version checks. I'm not sure if that's the correct behavior or not, but it came up for discussion.
So the reason, the concern is that if you're using this to say, I want to start using feature X, that means you presumably have some idea how feature X works, but there are many, many nightlies that are all version 1.45, which may all have incompatible versions of feature X.
Right.
So that means that my crate will only compile with some range of, like, nightlies after the point where it reached its final form, right?
Right. To clarify something, by the way, this was discussed at length in the RFC, and we did come to the conclusion that we are not trying to deal with the range of nightlies case. So this, in terms of, this is not something we think people should be able to distinguish ranges of nightlies using this config directive. The concern is more robustness when it comes to what if you're trying to look for a feature that will be released in 1.45? At what point should your compiler start counting as 1.45 for the purposes of those stable features? If you experience breakage because an earlier nightly did it differently, that's different than whether it should work with the nightly that it does work with.
Yeah, I tested out this config version using the nightly and checked it in, and then that version goes stable, but the feature actually didn't and got unstabilized or something, so it breaks on your compiler update.
Right, that would be the concern. And the flip side of that is, if we don't do this, then people may not be able to test upcoming versions of the compiler to determine, okay, I think this is the version I can use. Let me start compile testing my code against nightly with that feature. We would be effectively saying you don't get to use a config directive for the feature until the compiler has gone to at least beta, if not stable. So do we want to say that or not?
Do we have a nightly flag? I forget.
We intentionally omitted one.
I know it's been a back and forth.
Yeah, in the RFC,
For
there was
CFG
originally
nightly?
a proposal for like nightly with this date, and we ended up dropping it because bike shed.
That's fine.
Oh, and we ended up saying that if you want nightly, you should have a crate flag, a cargo feature, basically.
A cargo feature or a build script or something, yes.
I think I don't.
Part of
care
me
about-
feels like you don't really need more than 6 weeks to test your CFG version.
I'm not sure.
What does that imply? I don't understand what the takeaways from that statement.
I'm just thinking, so if you're writing this against something that's on nightly that's about to go stable, you have this using your nightly flag and your crate is working fine with the nightly flag. It's just a matter of when do you switch your crate over to looking for a CFG version for that piece of CFG code instead of the cargo feature, right?
Right, and given that you describe it that way, you certainly could say, if I'm on nightly and have set the nightly feature, or I have this version check, which would allow people with nightly to opt into just break if I don't seem to have the feature.
Yeah.
I mean, the point of
At that point, it's
version,
like, how urgently does your library actually need to expose this feature after release? If we were to say, just trying this out, not necessarily a proposal yet, but if we were to say, no, this only works once a stable release has been cut, then you couldn't test this until the stable release came out. But okay, so it takes you like 3 days after this feature is stable for your library to update on stable, okay?
You can test it, but you need a config flag, right? So you can always make your own config flag and build with Rust flags --CFG or something. You just can't like get it onto cargo and conveniently access it or get it into crates.
Right.
Is the proposal that no version is enabled on nightly ever? So like, or would you get config version? Is this like greater than or equal to?
I think it's the stable version.
right, I think that there's no point in having today's nightly not say, yes, I'm 1.20 or newer.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Great.
Because we have a stable version guarantee. Now, theoretically, hypothetically, if we ever had a Rust 2.0, it might claim to not be 1.3 because it's not compatible. Let's just assume that we're never going to do that because it'd be a really
Sounds
bad
good to me.
idea.
I think this is a really sort of in the weeds decision. Like I kind of lean towards the opinion that we should test the stable version, but if this was extensively discussed on the RFC, I'm inclined to go with whatever the consensus was at the time because.
So it was actually an unresolved question in the RFC,
Okay.
as far as I can tell. At least at the top of the tracking issue, it is listed as an unresolved question.
I guess the thing that persuades me, oh, sorry, Mark, go on.
I will note that at least historically, whenever crates do version detection and they are allowed to do that with like nightly, we've had some amount of trouble with bisection, where if you go back over the past, 4 or 5 weeks of nightlies, and they're testing for the current nightly, a lot of the time crates won't do it. Like they don't actually test for the feature. They say, oh, it's nightly, it must be recent. And that's sort of similar to this, where people would be sort of assuming that the current nightly is the latest nightly, but when you go back, oh no longer latest nightly, it just stops working entirely.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Or I think that's a good point. And I think that sort of accords with what I'm feeling, which is, I guess that stable code is the one we're most interested in, sort of like, we should prioritize the idea of I have a crate that builds no matter what compiler you use it with. And that includes, I think, nightly compilers. And you don't get that with this feature. And there's a number of workarounds. If we say that you're testing the stable version and what you actually want is to try out some stuff that's on nightly, you can do that in other ways by either having a feature or by having a Rust flag. Right. If you kind of can't get this, I work with any compiler you throw at me any other way.
I could see an argument for beta, but
Oh, I think it should include beta, because beta is like pretty fixed.
basically
Like,
stable.
we don't, and we don't. You don't like go back to beta 0.0. You know, maybe you can, but it's not. It's not so.
Not common.
Yeah, true.
It's rare enough to run the latest beta, let alone an older beta.
Yeah, like the whole point of beta is that you can try these things out and let us know in the 6 weeks before it becomes stable if any burning
Right.
problems. So it would defeat that
Yeah.
purpose entirely.
So let me ask a slight logistical question. How hard will it be for us to implement the idea that beta will say it's a new stable, but nightly it will say it's the last stable? We obviously know which branch of the compiler we're building for, but is this going to make it a pain and that every time you do beta, you need a special poke on a part of the compiler? Or can we make this automatic?
I think Nightly should report the beta version.
That's right. That's what I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't see why it'd be very hard, but you know.
It feels like, you know, a subtract one in the right place, or this nightly it's a greater than instead of a greater than or equal or something can
I could see that working.
make it
If we
work
can
out.
automate it, then I'm all for it. I just don't want anybody having to do a beta commit every beta to say, and here's the reporting version.
I don't know what the beta branching process is. If we have a script for it, it might not be that bad.
We already bump the version like manually on every Bootstrap week, so it's like it's not that much more work. We could even have a full list of versions that we report. It really doesn't matter that much.
I suppose that's
from an
true.
implementation perspective.
Okay, then in that case, do we have consensus on the notion that stable and beta should report their version and nightly should go back a version and report the last beta?
sounds good to me.
It's my opinion. I have not read.
138 stable should report 138, 139 beta should report 139, 140 nightly should report 139.
Right.
Sounds
And
good.
to be clear, this isn't really a special case so much as Nightly just doesn't report its own version, right? Because these are all greater than or equal to, or essentially greater than or equal to comparisons.
Right. Yeah, we didn't
We're
add
always
arbitrary
saying-
operators here. We just config version is are you at least.
Right.
Right.
It's just testing the beta version.
We're not really lying. We're just not telling you that.
No, you're just testing the beta version. We're not lying at all.
Okay. I can summarize this issue and proposal then for the tracking issue thread.
It's interesting because it might actually encourage people to use the beta more often, perhaps, if they care about this, although maybe they won't.
So at least one person complaining on the issue said that it will instead just cause people to go back to doing version detection and build scripts, but I am slightly skeptical of that. Especially, I am hoping that in the common case, people can use things like config accessible. Version is really just for, we added this feature to the language that isn't detectable by the availability of a symbol.
Yeah, I feel like the cost of the build script is such a pain that just making the change when the beta rolls around is totally reasonable. It doesn't take 6 weeks to update the CFG flag and push it to crates.io.
Do we ban more recent, like if I say config version 150 today, will that error? Or, okay, I assume it won't, right?
It won't error, it'll just be false, which is
So
what
I
it's
can just-
supposed to do.
So I can ship a crates.io release now that will start working in theory once beta
I have to go.
launches.
I have another meeting.
So do I.
That's an
there are
interesting
several
point.
Open RFCs, by the way, if folks want to double check and see which boxes they need to check.
The point about way out feature is interesting because I kind of want to block that from there's no way that can possibly be right, but that also would prevent this from being useful on old compilers. So
Right, that's kind
I
of
don't know
the
how to
point
do
of
that.
this, is to detect new compilers. if
I'm
you
gonna-
block it on
Hold on,
old compilers.
Nico has to
what's the
leave
point?
and the recording's gonna stop when Nico leaves, right? I think it's important that we actually
Also
wrap
need
up
to
properly.
conclude, I think.
Yeah, I
Okay.
agree.
All right.